In the last video, I looked at hypercubes 3 and contrasted that with hypercubes 2. Now I'm going to take hypercubes 3 and contrast it with implied hypercubes, basically. So what's going on is the only change I made is that if I go into this hypercube view, as you recall, in hypercubes 3, every hypercube had the same name. So what I did in implied, proof implied, I removed the explicit hypercubes whenever I could, and therefore that reveals that basically when you don't have an explicit hypercube, there's an implied hypercube that you can imply. That's why it's called an implied hypercube. It's not really there, but you can consider it. You can consider the representation to work just like if there was a hypercube there. So why is it that I can't make all of them implied? Well, the reason is you can use an implied hypercube. You don't have to have an explicit hypercube if you have no non-core dimensions. So here you only have the core dimensions of concept, period, and reporting entity. Okay, reporting entity, period, concept. Here you have concept, period, and reporting entity, but another explicit dimension was added. You can see that in the model. There's a dimension that was added. It uses the term axis, which is, in my view, should be avoided. But you can see that is why you have to use an explicit hypercube here, here, in this variance, because you have to add a scenario dimension. And in this segment revenue hypercube, you have to add a segment dimension. Besides that, everything can be implied. And that is the only difference. Again, the number of blocks is exactly the same. The number of information blocks is exactly the same. The disclosures, again, are fewer bugs, but forget about that in this application. That's really it for the difference between proof implied and proof hypercubes 3. Here, everything is represented in a hypercube of the same name. And here, I've removed every hypercube that I could remove, leaving only the ones that I must use. And this is why, basically, you have to use a dimensional model when you represent financial reports, because it's multidimensional. You do have, anybody could have a prior period error. Anybody could have, this is basically a difference between, a budgeted number and an actual number. Could be a forecasted number, but you can have a variance or a difference. And any organization could have business segments or geographic areas. So financial information is inherently multidimensional. That's why you have to have explicit dimensions, and that's why you have to use hypercubes. Anyway, I'm going to call that good.